Thank you all so much for attending a virtual event on this rainy, absolutely gross day in New England. We appreciate you taking the time to sit at your computers once more after probably sitting on your computers all day. um, this is the last event we're doing this week. Tomorrow or next week is pretty light because we want to make sure everyone has time to go out and vote and not be unhindered by anything else on their calendar. So please vote if you haven't already. But thank you all so much for coming tonight and supporting an independent bookstore and these authors. Julia is our MC and she will be leading the event tonight. Thanks, Julia.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amanda, and really thank you to Belmont Books. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight. We're really happy to have you on our second virtual Craft on Draft. And even though we can't see you, I think we can feel you out in the Zoomosphere, Pinot Grigio in hand. Authors, I can feel the energy. Can you all feel the energy coming to us? Yeah. Just put your hand to the screen. I think we'll feel it, right? And I really hope you're all doing as well as possible, considering the very momentous times we're living in. I'm really grateful to be able to take this time to celebrate reading and writing with some really amazing authors tonight. And we've worked really hard to keep this discussion safe and secure for everyone. So I want to thank Grub Street, the Novel Incubator Program, and fantastic Belmont Books for sponsoring and helping us organize the event. So my name is Julie or Julia Rold. You have several options. I'll also answer to hey you or who ate that. I'm one of a committee with 4 really wonderful people who organizes Craft on Draft, and I'm honored to be the MC tonight. So our subject for tonight is we're going to think about writing what we don't know very well. We were thinking about this in Craft on Draft committee, and we thought we would love to have 3 authors who had used research to craft fiction that really engages readers. I know a lot of people in our audience, writing historical fiction. We're also writing about, other cultures. And so I think it's really wonderful to have 3 amazing authors who've really done this with sensitivity and intelligence and artistry. So I'm really happy to welcome Jeffrey Colvin, Daphne Kalotay, and Rishi Reddi. And thank you all 3 for coming. We know you didn't have to leave your house, but we still appreciate the effort. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little overview, and then we'll have an icebreaker, and then we'll have each author will read for 10 minutes, all right? Just in the chat, you'll be able to notice some fun facts about the authors that they've provided for us. And there's a Q&A, so if you have any questions at the end, if you could just put your questions in the Q&A. You can put them in the chat too, but it's harder to kind of comb through the chat. So in the Q&A, please. We will hope to wrap up by around 8 p.m. at the latest. And also just a reminder that the author's books are available with Belmont Books, and that link will also be in the chat very, very often. And we hope that you will all buy these wonderful, wonderful novels tonight. So just to begin as an icebreaker, before I introduce each author in more detail, we thought we'd ask each author when they first started to write. So Jeffrey, can we start with you? When did you first start to write?
Yes, well, thank you, Julie, and also thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Belmont Books, and to all the people that came out to hear me. I started writing, I would say probably in earnest about 20 years ago. I had a variety of different careers, the military, advertising, worked on the Hill, but I always wanted to write, but never really, I think, figured I had the skills to do so. And I actually took my first writing class at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education.
Oh, wow.
I think it was like $100 back in 1990 something. And so I started taking fiction classes, and then sort of went from there, and then have been sort of went back and did an MFA, and then began to work from there. Mm-hmm. So it's been about 20 years or so, I would say, that I started writing in earnest fiction.
Yeah, great. What about you, Daphne?
Yes, I think I started to actually write with real effort and study my senior year of my last semester, actually a senior year of college, when I took my first class. And I realized this was something that I could study and really apply myself to. But I will say there was some point when I was cleaning my old bedroom and I found a journal from second grade, and I saw a short story that I had started, and I'll tell you where it ended.
What was the title? Do you remember?
I can't remember the title. I just know it was all going along, and then there was the phrase, then all of the sudden, and that was where it ended. So I clearly
What a
got
cliffhanger.
Woo! Quite early.
Cliffhanger.
You got to finish that story now, Daphne.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. What about you, Rishi?
Yeah, I have one of those stories that I have a journal, a notebook from when I was 9 years old, where I have a story with a protagonist named Leela and all of that. So the urge was very early, I think, to be writing and rendering tales. But I also didn't start writing in with great seriousness until my last semester, senior year, just like you, Daphne, in college, where I had to submit an entry to get into a creative writing workshop. So that was like the first time that I felt like I had to complete something. And then after that, many years later, just like you, Jeffrey, I also took a class at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. And it was through them in the mid 1990s that I met a writing group. You know, I met somebody who knew somebody, you know, a writing group. And I have been attending that writing group monthly since 1995, you know, as a,
wow.
So very influential for me, the Adult Center for Education in Cambridge.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, that was fun. So let's move on to the serious craft part of our presentation tonight. But before we do that, we have one more thing. We have one more tradition at Craft on Draft, and that is we always have to talk a little bit about the draft part, because even though you might think out there that it's about writing your first draft, but it's not. It's not that kind of draft. Actually, it probably should be called Craft with Draft, you know, because we have to ask each one of you what you are drinking tonight and why. Can you tell us what you're drinking tonight and why? And I've just got my Detective Pikachu cup with water. So that's my partay. What are you all doing?
Well, I have salsa with lime.
Okay.
That's my creative choice.
Good.
I have a glass of sherry because long ago, when I was had the great privilege and honor to do an independent study with Anita Desai, she invited me over to her house once, and I was like ecstatic for dinner. And it was a night like tonight, terrible, rainy, horrible. And I walked in with my flowers, and she said, Rishi, you must have a glass of sherry. It's so cold outside. So I thought I would honor that memory with this.
Yeah, great.
And I'm drinking also with the cold in mind, but I made a hot toddy. So I have just a tiny bit
what's in it? Rum?
Scotch, actually, and then a lot of hot water and honey and lemon, and it's delicious. And yeah.
Great.
So.
Okay, well, good. Thank you all. And I hope everyone else is enjoying a glass of something at home. All right, so we're going to begin. Each author, as I said, will talk for about 10 minutes. And please remember to put your questions in the chat at the end, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So my first task tonight, which I'm really honored to do, is to introduce Jeffrey Colvin. I was really honored to interview Jeffrey for Dead Darlings in the spring, not long after his debut novel Africaville came out from HarperCollins. And he's just gone on to tremendous success since that time. He was recently awarded a 2020 Honor Fiction Prize by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and a Hurston Wright Legacy Award. So it's just so exciting, Jeffrey. Congratulations for that. In addition, Africaville has been featured in Publishers Weekly, NPR, Vogue, the Boston Globe, the BBC, the CBC, the Globe and Mail, LitHub, and elsewhere. His essays and short fiction have appeared in Narrative, Hot Metal Bridge, Painted Bride Quarterly, Rain Taxi Review of Books, The Millions, The Brooklyn Rail, and many other magazines. He very impressively graduated from the US Naval Academy and Harvard University and Columbia, where he received an MFA in fiction. He is an assistant editor at Narrative Magazine. And this fall, he's the Hodson Trust John Carter Brown Fellow at Brown University. So he's in Providence, but he's also a fellow Southerner. So I'm really happy to introduce him. Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wonderful book with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you very much. I'd like to start with a question that I often get from people when they find out that I am writing a novel. And the question is, you're a young man who is from Alabama. How did you come to write a novel about Canada? Well, one answer that I normally give is that the novel is about a little bit more than Canada. I like to say Africaville chronicles 3 generations of the Seaboat family and takes the writers from Halifax to Montreal to Vermont and down into the deep South states of Mississippi and Alabama. And along the way, it covers a lot of issues, cross-racial relationships, and the meaning of family and the meaning of home. And I began writing Africaville in the late 1990s when I was working on a series of short stories set, since this is about history and talking about the way history is crafted into fiction. I was writing stories set in Alabama along the Montgomery's to Selma march that was taken by Dr. Martin Luther King in the 60s. And I was writing about these rural towns along that route, and the stories, I was doing a lot of research, but I also had some family members who had also raised kids in rural Alabama. And so when I was writing these stories, I had heard about a village in Nova Scotia called Africaville, just north of Halifax. And it was in the news in the 60s because over the objections of the residents, the city of Halifax went in and razed the town and forced the people off their land. And the same thing had happened in Alabama in terms of where my grandmother lived. She wasn't forced, but the community she grew up in no longer existed. It was sort of gone. And I had come back from college to visit one day and saw that the houses had been razed. And so I thought, well, there's got to be a connection between this town and these places that I'm writing about in rural Alabama that no longer exist, and this town in Halifax, Nova Scotia that no longer exists. And from that, I began to do a bit of research. And I learned that the people in the town really objected to the town being destroyed. And they had fought very vociferously to have the town not be destroyed, but in the end it had been. And so as I began to do research, I thought, well, this would be a good, interesting group of characters to write about. And so that sort of launched me into the research about into the lives of the people in Canada. And so what I'd like to talk about is sort of 2 aspects of the research I did. One was into the actual village itself, sort of how I constructed the village of Africaville for my novel. And so I think I want to start with that. Most of you, the village of Africaville in Halifax, when I started researching this novel, I didn't know very much about how Blacks had come to Canada. And so as I begun doing the research, I sort of found 3 main sources for my fictional village in Canada. One was the early wars in North America. At the start of the American Revolution, whites loyal to Britain began to bring their slaves up to Canada with them. During this period, a group of Blacks arrived in Canada as a result of several proclamations issued by governors and military leaders. And so Blacks began to come up to Canada during the American Revolution. The largest group, however, came up during the War of 1812, when a proclamation was issued by a British commander. And some researchers say that this was one of the largest groups emancipated prior to the Civil War. And so war and upheaval was one way Blacks came up to Canada. Initially, they settled in the area of Quebec, but then also they then went on to Nova Scotia as well. The second group of people that made up my fictional town came up to Canada through the thing we know as the Underground Railroad. Between 1820 and 1865, some estimates are that about 100,000 Blacks left the South going north. Well, we know a lot about some statistics about some of them that stayed in the United States, but very little about the ones that went on to Canada. And so I began to research that aspect of how people who came up during the Underground Railroad got to Canada. And it turns out some of them also wound up in Nova Scotia as well. And then finally, there were the people who arrived in Canada from the Caribbean. There was a large group of Blacks who were kicked out of Jamaica and put on ships around 1796 and brought to Canada. And so the group that came up during the wars, the groups that came up on the Underground Railroad, and the groups that came over from the Caribbean, principally Jamaica, were the three groups that formed the basis for my fictitious town of Africaville. And so it turns out that the matriarch of the novel, Capella Seaboat, her family on her father's side was descended from the Jamaicans and people from Trinidad who came over to Halifax. And so that was the information that I used to form my village. Now, since mine was made up, it's a fictional village, I then had to craft that into a scene in the novel. And so now I'd like to read the opening of the novel. And so that will let us sort of see how that information was incorporated into the novel. This is the opening of Africaville. It's called, the opening chapter is called Dog Trot Fever. Nova Scotia, 1918. Newborns are never afflicted with the malady. The swollen tongue, the reddish throat, the raw cough seem to afflict only babies older than 6 months. By the spring, in the village situated on a small knuckle-shaped peninsula just north of Halifax, all 5 of the stricken babies have now developed a high fever. Having no luck with sweet milk and lemon bitter, worried mothers administer castor oil mixed with camphor, then a tea of beer's root steeped with beech ash and clover. When desperate, they even place a few charms under the mattresses of the beds where the stricken babies lie crying. Nothing works. In mid-April, with 3 more babies now suffering from the malady, health department nurses visit the village, their faces frozen even before they have examined a single new case. Why our children, several mothers standing in the yard of one house wants to know. Hadn't Halifax already given enough babies in the fire that leveled 10 square blocks of the city months before when the munitions ship exploded in the harbor? Then again, those had been white babies. No colored babies had died in that explosion. Was it now Woods Bluff's turn to lose infants? And if so, how many? 5, 10, all 22? The following week, after 2 of the feverish babies die, the mothers turn to the grandmothers, though many are leery of this option. Already, several grandmothers have suggested that since the home remedies haven't worked, and since neither nurse nor doctor has useful medicines, the afflicted infants must be bad luck babies. It is an expression the mothers haven't heard since they were children, though the fear of having a bad luck baby had terrorized mothers on the bluff as far back as 1790. That was the year the first groups of cabins sprang up across the bluff, displacing the fox, hare, and moose that ran through the thick Christmas ferns and sheep laurel. Back then, when no medicine could reinvigorate a baby whose body had begun to show the outlines of bones, smothering was sometimes recommended. Take no action, and bad luck might infect the entire village. Best to end the child's suffering midday when injurious spirits would be bedside, feeding on the moisture of a weak baby's last breath. Yet several mothers are unconvinced the deceased infants are bad luck babies. And even if the now suffering babies are saddled with bad luck, who's to say those old tales of smothering are true? Had anyone seen a mother place a blanket or pillow over a child's face? And most important, for these new cases, by what evidence will we make the diagnosis? The grandmothers had ready answers. For several descendants of the Virginian who came up to Nova Scotia in 1772 as a messenger in the British Army, a feverish baby had to be put to sleep if its father had recently had a limb severed above the knee or elbow. Death was also imminent if the baby's fever came during the same month as the mother's birthday. For the granddaughter of the Congolese woman who in 1785 dressed as a man sailed into Halifax Harbor on a ship out of Lisbon, Portugal, a feverish baby had to be smothered if the newborn was smaller than a man's hand. And for the largest group of grandmothers, those descended from the nearly 200 Jamaicans who landed in Halifax Harbor in 1788 after being expelled by British soldiers from their island villages for fomenting rebellion, a feverish baby's fate was sealed if the baby coughed up blood during the same month a man traveling arrived on your stoop selling quill turpentine, goat leather, or gunpowder. Hadn't such a vendor made the rounds in Woods Bluff the month before? Why continue to nurse such a child? Death already had a square toe on the baby's throat. It was only a matter of days, a week maybe, if the baby were a girl. And so that was how I wrapped the idea of the Revolutionary War and the Jamaicans and the other. I had to find a vessel into which to place the research. And I decided that that vessel would be a community under siege. And I had read about there's my time. So I'd read about the 1980 the 1980 influenza epidemic. And so I used something similar to that to wrap the history in. So that was how I did that. And I see that my time is up.
No, that was great, Jeffrey. Thank you so much. I think it's so interesting, that, the vessel you created, and each of the vessels you created. I mean, I know your main character, Kathella, is coming very soon, right? She's kind of the inheritor of these fevered, this fevered time, right? Whenever,
Yes.
But a survivor. So I think it was wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. Okay, so we'll be moving on to our second author, but please, if you have any questions for Jeffrey, make sure you put them in the Q&A. Also, remember to buy his book, his amazing book, Africaville. Again, we'll put the link in the chat to Belmont Books, so it's easily available for you. Okay, our next author is the wonderful Daphne Kalotay. This is Daphne's second time at Craft on Draft, so thanks so much, Daphne, for coming back. And I'll just say a little bit about Daphne. So published in over 20 languages, Daphne Kalotay's books include the award-winning novels, Sightseeing and Russian Winter, the fiction collection, Calamity and Other Stories, shortlisted for the Story Prize, and her new wonderful novel, Blue Hours, which was a 2020 Massachusetts Book Awards must read. Congratulations, Daphne, on that. That's great. Her work has received fellowship from the Christopher Isherwood Foundation, the McDowell Colony, and Yaddo, among others. And her story, Relativity, was the 2017 One City, One Story Boston pick. Daphne currently teaches at Princeton University's program in creative writing, but she makes her home in Somerville, Mass, where she is also a real champion for other writers in the area. She's really always giving counsel and encouragement to everyone in the writing community. So thank you for that too, Daphne. So we're really happy to have you.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here and back at Craft on Draft, and also just so great to hear Jeffrey's wonderful excerpt. I just got the book today, so I'm really looking forward to reading. And also always happy to talk about this topic. And I will say that with this book, first of all, I had no intention of doing research for this novel. The first almost half of this book takes place in the early 1990s in New York City, which I knew pretty well. So when I started writing, the premise of this novel, Blue Hours, was that the narrator, Mim, she's in her early 40s and she's recalling her life back then, because now, 2 decades later, a dear friend from that era of the past, a woman named Kira, has gone missing abroad. Where abroad, when I began writing, I didn't know, but I thought that was okay. I'd figure it out as I wrote. And I also thought that since the story was being told by Mim here in the US, Kira's story could actually take place off page. So I just wrote this part about New York City circa 1991, 92. And as I was writing, some themes emerged. So first there was, of course, America's engagement in the first Gulf War. Mim also, through a key relationship, witnesses firsthand white supremacy in action. In this particular case, the legacy of colonialism. And I knew that these themes of foreign interventionism and Western imperialism, expressed as white paternalism, were key threads that would tie the two halves of the book together. So in deciding where Kira had gone missing, there were plenty of countries that would have allowed me to explore these themes, but the more I thought about it, when I connected the dots from that first Gulf War, the more it became clear that I needed Kira to be in Afghanistan, because that's where the US is, and it's where we've been since 2001. It's where we still are. It's our longest war. And too many of us ignore it because we can. And this is in fact part of our Western privilege, that we can ignore our own war if we don't feel like reading that article in the paper today, right? If it doesn't really affect us directly. And I wanted to write about that. And I wanted to show an American woman grappling with that and recognizing herself as part of this. But I had never been there. I had no close friends there. I had a close friend who had lived in Western Afghanistan for a few years, but that was about it. So as soon as I decided that that was where this other character had gone missing as part of her work abroad, I put a call out to everyone I knew who could maybe help me learn more, and began learning. And as always happens, once I commit to something, I feel like things always fall into place. And I immediately met some really helpful people, and I began reading nonstop history, memoirs, travelogues, political analysis. And it probably wasn't for another year, at least, until I narrowed down where in the country this character would even be exactly, at which point I could do more targeted research. And by the time I realized that my protagonist, Mim, would have to actually go there, I confronted a quandary, which was that at that point, I now, of course, knew a lot more about the country than she did, and then she could. Even worse, this was the first time that I had written a novel in the first person. And boy, was I kicking myself for that because in the third person, as we've just seen beautifully in Jeffrey's excerpt, you can really express so much, right, with this, in that case, a pretty omniscient narrator. But here I had a first person voice, and I was limited to what this character knew. And on the one hand, she isn't a completely ignorant American abroad, and she like knows a little bit, but she wouldn't be able to understand what people were saying if it wasn't in English. Anything I wanted the reader to know that she wouldn't know was going to have to be delivered in some other way. So I'm going to read for you a scene that represents two things that I tried to figure out. First of all, a way of combining what my narrator would be able to observe with what another character could tell her and then us, the readers. And also trying to get across to readers a sort of ambiguity that I thought there would be in the relationships between, in this case, Afghans who are in one way profiting from the presence of Americans there, while also, of course, having to put up with the presence of Americans occupying their country. Because Americans who are traveling or working there often need the help of these Afghan fixers who are making money, right, by being translators and guides, but you know, they're also having to deal with this constant presence. So I wanted to try to deal with that contradiction and try to show, see what I could reveal without maybe saying too much. So here, let me just read a little excerpt. So this is soon after she arrives. This is in 2012. And this old friend Kira has been doing humanitarian aid work in Jalalabad in eastern Afghanistan. And Mim has been convinced to go there to try and help by Kira's ex. And he's a guy named Roy, that you just need to know this for this little scene. Roy is a rich Newport, Rhode Island guy. And he has hired consultants in Afghanistan, and he also hired a guide for them who has now passed them off to someone they don't know. It's a young man named Asim. And Mim can't quite get a handle on him, but he's really important to this whole book. In this scene, they've asked Asim to take them to a village where they think there's someone who knows where Kira went. And all you need to know is that Asim has a very large scar on one cheek, and he's engaged to a woman named Fareshta, whom he talks about a lot, because he's working to earn the bride price, which is a sort of dowry for her. Okay, mid-morning by the time Asim comes to fetch us. The scar on his cheek manages to surprise me all over again, these two very different sides of one face. We swap tidings, Asim allowing that he is well, thanks be to God. His health is good, his family is awesome. God is great, very well, thank you. But when Roy hands him the piece of paper with the name of the village, Asim shakes his head. You don't know it? Roy asks. I know it, but it is like too far. Roy frowns. How far? 20, 30 kilometers. That's nothing. The road is dangerous, man. I will need more money. Oh, so money makes it less dangerous? A risk fee. Asim stands his ground. Roy takes another bill from his money clip. Very dangerous, Asim says. Bandits, Taliban, police. Roy raises his eyebrows, though surely he's read the stories of two-timing warlords, of crooked policemen, of improvised explosives at the side of the road. At the same time, I tell myself Asim must be exaggerating, given the assurance we've had from Roy's guys. Probably it's for the bride price. We're Americans, I remind Roy. It's a risk for Asim just to have us in his car. Asim nods. Taliban have a new offer. You help them to kill a foreigner, they give you a motorbike. Fine, Roy says and shoves another bill at Asim. Taliban pay $200 per month. I assure myself this is all in the name of love. Roy grimaces, peels off another bill. Now let's get going. We head out to the sad little Toyota, where Asim opens the trunk and extracts a bundle of fabric. Unfolded, the material becomes the ubiquitous Afghan scarf and brownish patu blanket. For me, he has a black robe, much larger than my pashmina. It's better this way, Asim explains, handing us the clothing, for checkpoints. The garment covers me completely. I wrap it tight, along with the scarf over my head, while Asim has Roy remove his glasses. What about Roy's stiff, clean new boots, I want to ask. Surely those give him away, but I suppose no one will see our feet in the car. Asim's shoes are slip-on rubber things molded to look like sneakers. Even the laces, tongue, label, everything molded onto one continuous piece of rubber. No seatbelt, please, he says when he sees me and Roy buckling ourselves in. That too could give us away. And so we head off to the village, seatbeltless, in our new clothes. The main road, although recently paved, is already pocked with holes. With all the reconstruction projects and heavy military equipment, Asim explains, the thin asphalt ruts quickly. Soon we're bouncing behind buses reeking of diesel, following grumbling, brightly painted trucks, their many little bells jingling, their windows decorated with tassels and curtains. Asim tells us he grew up in a village south of here. He's 27 years old, the seventh of 9 children. His father was a raisin washer. He hoped for his children to be learned, Asim says. But this was during Taliban time, lots of Quran in school, not much else. My brothers now are bricklayers, but I didn't want that. I studied more English. He first studied when just a boy, in secret. From the most learned man in town, he had a lot of books in English. But then, the Taliban, they found the books. My lessons stopped. Since 2002, he tells us, he has been learning from American dudes and security dudes. They gave me music. Bruce Springsteen, Led Zeppelin, Rolling Stones. I read the words of the songs on my phone. I can't get no satisfaction. I can't tell if his joke is genuine or a standard line for our benefit. Fareshta too, he adds, likes rock music. Man, her English is better than mine. That's when I spot a mangled truck abandoned at the side of the road, burnt and blistered with brush growing up around it. Oil tanker, Asim says, so matter-of-factly, it's hard to tell what his feelings about it might be. And though it's clear this happened some time ago, I still feel a cold spider crawl up my spine. Roy says, I can't see a thing without my damn glasses. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks, Daphne. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful, Daphne. So wonderfully, so beautifully read. Both you and Jeffrey, thank you. Okay, so we're moving on. Again, put your questions in the chat. Don't forget to buy the book. Anything else? Any other comments, please? I'd love to see the active chat. So it's great. So we're on to our final author tonight. And I will just, it's my honor to introduce her as well. Rishi Reddi. Rishi is the author of 2 books of fiction, Karma and Other Stories and Passage West. And Karma and Other Stories was just a huge winner of so many things. We all loved that book. It was the 2008 Penn New England Ella Winship Prize winner. It was one of the stories was featured in Best American. It was broadcast on National Public Radio, performed at New York City Symphony Space, and also one of the stories was chosen for Boston Book Festival's One City, One Story. Rishi's debut novel, Passage West, has been recommended by The Bustle, Book Riot, Ms. Magazine and the Millions, and her essays and translations have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Asian American Literary Review, and the Partisan Review. And she's received numerous awards, grants, and fellowships from the MacDowell Colony and many others. And in addition to all that, in addition to her really amazing writing career, she is also an amazing environmental lawyer for the state and for the federal government for more than 25 years. So she has two very illustrious careers, and I'm so happy to be able to introduce her tonight. She lives in Cambridge, Rishi Reddi.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you to Belmont Books for hosting this tonight. And it's so fun to be here with my longtime friend, Daphne Kalotay, Julie Rold, and my new friend, Jeffrey Colvin. It's really a fun night. One of the best ones of these that I've come to. So thank you so much. I just want to tell a little bit about Passage West, that the idea for the book was something that I thought of when I was in my first year in law school in a constitutional law class, when I first heard about Punjabi men who had come to the United States and settled in California, had fought in World War I for the United States and had won citizenship to the US through that service. And later on, the US Supreme Court rescinded that citizenship. So I didn't even know at that time, I was a young woman in my early 20s, that Indians had even been in the United States at that time. And my family, I was born in India, my family came over in 1971, 60 years, 70 years after these individuals that I was reading about. And I had thought that nobody had come, before our wave of citizenship. So this started a decades-long fascination with this topic that I think I knew deep down inside the amount of research it would take. And I wanted to get those short stories out beforehand because they didn't require, any research almost. But I knew this would be a large undertaking. So when I got those short stories out, I thought, okay, now I'm ready for this. I know a little bit about what I'm doing in terms of fiction technique. And now I can try to take on this bigger task with all of the research that it would require. So that was way back in 2005, 2006. And I started and I got lost in the research. It was just so fascinating to me just to start with that one case that I alluded to, but then also to find out that there was a whole community of Punjabis, mostly men and some from other parts of India too, but mostly from Punjab and in the space that's now partially Pakistan, partially India, to see that they had built these careers in the western part of California. They were lumberjacks, they were laying the railroad, they were farming on California soil and all over that portion of the country. And then I found out about all of this other history, which was about a ship that was trying to bring Indians and South Asians over from the subcontinent to Canada that got blocked by the Canadians because they didn't want these South Asians to come over and land in Canada, even though they were British citizens. Canada at that time was British land. So that became something else that I had to put into the novel. Then the pandemic, the flu, was something that I found out probably 5 or 6 years into my research because it really wasn't talked about the way that we're talking about our current pandemic. Then I felt like I gotta put that in the novel. So it was just like one thing that was fascinating to me after another. And I finally picked my head up after all of these years of getting lost in the research. And I thought, how am I going to incorporate this all into a story? And it, really shaped what I thought was going to be a small novel about one man who has left his wife behind in Punjab and is tempted through this sort of cross-cultural, cross-racial love affair with a Mexican woman he meets in California. It became that love triangle story to something that had political implications and civil rights overtones and freedom fighters and the revolutionary movement against the British that started on American soil. So that's sort of the journey of this book. But I wanted to say that a couple of things I learned along the way was I felt like it was very difficult to not only apply fiction techniques around conflict and around dialogue, and all of the usual things that we grapple with as fiction writers, like, are we going to choose, as Daphne said, first person or third person, or are we going to take big historical things like the Civil War that Jeffrey was talking about and put it into the small vessel of one town. So how was I going to do this? And this was I decided that one thing that I would do was I needed to understand all perspectives of a particular time. So if there was a race riot that I was going to write about, I felt like I needed to understand every single perspective around that race riot. Both, all 2 or 3 factions that were involved. How would those opinions be portrayed? Because I needed to speak those opinions through particular characters. These big political movements needed to be made manageable by being spoken through just one character conveying that viewpoint to another character conveying that viewpoint, so that it could mold into some of what we know more familiarly as conflict in fiction. So that was one thing that I feel like I had to really grapple with. Then I felt like I had so much information, and I also felt like, was I going to go with the third person? Was I going to go with an omniscient narrator? How was I going to convey all this information in a non-boring way? Because something else I realized at cocktail parties and talking to loved ones is that nobody really cared about these people as much as I did. So I thought, was I going to make this interesting to folks? So I chose a bunch of different ways. I chose that I was going to use not only regular narration, and the story is told in third person through 4 point of view characters, 4 men who are friends or frenemies, to be more accurate. But I was also going to use newspaper articles that I found at the time, in my research, where I selected actual language, or I selected a article that I found in the Brawley News, but parlayed it into the fictitious newspaper in the fictitious town. And, the material was so good that I didn't even need to change anything except for the masthead or the byline of the paper. That also gave me the opportunity to go into the newspaper that the revolutionary South Asians started to publish in California, galvanizing for freedom from the British. I could use their actual language about how they were going to, recruit for their militia and all of this. So, and then the last technique I used was, I thought, because so many of these men had their love interests or their closest friendships not where they were. So, there is a wife who is much adored by a lead character named Ram. And the only, the depiction of their romance was really through the letters between them. But because I was dealing mostly with men, what the letters allowed me to do is it allowed his wife to speak for herself. So I decided I was going to incorporate that as well. And so it was through all of these sort of different select ways that I was trying to portray all of the different angles of the reality of that time. So I'm just going to read this portion from, the novel is set in the Imperial Valley, which is the far southern part of California, right on the border with the Mexican, with the Mexican border. And it's actually a part of the country that is very rural. And most people who don't live right around there don't really know much about it. And the way that it was desert land that was known mostly to Native Americans who lived there. And later people came there, as you'll hear in the reading, from so many different places. And so I also felt like in the novel, I was talking about this population of folks who had settled in the US from South Asia that nobody knew about. So I had to, tell people about that. But then I also had to tell them about a part of America that most people didn't know about. And how was I going to do that? So in this conversation, which is between two main characters, Ram, the man that I mentioned before, who leaves his wife behind in South Asia. He's very young, he's in his early 20s, and he's talking to this older man that he has come to live with, whom he had never known before, but through a series of events comes to live with him in the Imperial Valley. And this grows into a very special relationship for both of them. So I thought I would just read from that. And the older man's name, old enough to be his father, is named Jeevan. This is in September 1914. In the valley, before and after the Great Flood, everyone had come from somewhere else. This is what Jeevan told Ram when he asked. 5,000 people lived there, about 700 in the town of Fredonia itself. Over the past weeks, since Ram had decided to stay, Jeevan thought he asked too many questions. Like a boy, like a naive lad, even though he was married. Jeevan listed the places that the people had come from: Germans, Chinese, Greeks, Filipinos, Swiss, Portuguese, Japanese, Italians, Irish, the Africans who had been slaves moving west from Dixie because freedom had not yet arrived, the Texans and the Kansans and New Yorkers, of course, the Mexicans who had once owned it, and the natives too, who knew the land best of all. They were in the wagon, Jeevan and Ram, going to town to pick up a cedar that had been repaired. Ram had insisted on driving. But how did they know there would be work for them here? Ram asked. Why did they come when the river had destroyed so much? They came to help hold the river back, Jeevan said. It was the reason they came. The entire country knew the dam had broken and the land was flooded. The Imperial Land Company didn't know what to do. The valley towns were new. Some of them did not even have a post office. Shacks served as bank, hospital, jailhouse. They could fly away, gone, just like this, Jeevan flicked his hand. The water took them. Every day I saw a wagon being carried off by the Colorado River, sometimes horses and cows. One time, a man. So many fields completely gone, roads and paths disappeared. Seeing it now, Baiji, it seems impossible, Ram said. Everybody living here labored to hold the river back, Jeevan said, rich and poor, women and men. We used shovels to keep piling dirt on top of dirt to make levees, but still more workers came to build jetties and new embankments. Government paid them, fed them, made places for them to keep. Who would come for such a job? Ram said. Jeevan was struck by the boy's innocence. Had he never known real hardship? He was clicking to the mules now, urging them ahead, unaware of the insult he had given. I would, Jeevan said. The boy glanced at him, brushed his hair away from his dark eyes. Forgive me, Baiji. Yes, the boy was naive, but Jeevan liked his deference. So many different people living together, Ram continued cautiously, by their own choice? Why not? For 2 days without sleep, I bailed water to protect the power generator, side by side with the sheriff. We hauled sacks filled with gravel to make barricades. We kept the water back. From that time on, the sheriff has been a friend to me. Stop there.
Great. Thank you, Kylie. Wonderfully. Thank you, Rishi. And again, thanks to Daphne and Jeffrey too. Just such wonderful readings. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I noticed you all nodding a lot. You probably have questions for each other now that you'd like to ask, because it was, as one of you would say something, I could see your other ones going, mm-hmm. So it was really funny to see that. So yeah, one more thing before I start in on the questions. I know we're pushing 8 o'clock. I hope everyone can stay just a few minutes longer so that we can finish up. We'll try to finish up by say 8:10. But I also wanted to say, if you're interested in coming to the next Craft on Draft, obviously we'll put out it in our usual channels, but if you would give us your email in the chat, and we can take a list of emails as well for our email list. Okay, and remember again, buy the books from Belmont Books. All right, so we've got a lot of good questions. So I'll start with this one, and I think I'll begin with Rishi, but I think it's appropriate for a number of you. So I think all of you have had really interesting journeys towards finishing your books. You know, a lot, you know, lots of years of doing this. You know, if you could share, you know, how did you keep going, you know, through those years of research? Rishi, we'll start with you because the question was first directed to you, but as I said, I know it's appropriate to Jeffrey and Daphne as well. Yeah, how did you keep going and doing all the research, you know, through the years that you did it? And
It
you know,
was
and also how long did it take you? I think that's a similar question we've had. Yeah.
Yeah, it actually took me, I would say, anywhere from 13 to 15 years, the way that you work off and on, and the novel lives in the back of your mind, during all that time. And as I said, I was fascinated by the research, and so I got carried away from it, but really, I felt when the 2016 election came about, I had all of this research, and the novel, was a little mushy. It was very hard to shape. And it was hard for me to think about what perspective I was going to, what angle I was taking with the book. But when that election happened, I suddenly realized, what it was that I had to say. And all of that suddenly took form very distinctly to me. And it went through, I was on my third editor by the time, I got to the end. I was very, very sad to lose the first one, who was a big champion of the book. But that message that I felt like I had to get out post 2016 is really what carried me through in terms of getting the story out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about you, Jeffrey? I know you had a long journey as well. Oh, and you're on mute, Jeffrey, just so you know. There, yeah.
Yes, I mentioned that I started writing the short stories in about 1999, and then I read the article about the Afric bill in the Times in 2001. And, I had been working on the book since I was, in some sense, learning to write at the same time. So I tried to be a little bit patient with the book as I went along. And also, things happen too. You have family deaths and those kinds of things. And also, I took some time away from the novel from time to time to work on other writing. And I thought that was very important for me because I felt I was still learning, sort of working on my writing muscle. So I would write essays and book reviews and those kinds of things. And I think that would give me a chance to work on something else, but also to spend a little bit of time away from the book so that I'd come back to it with a fresh eye. And so, but I think mainly mine took a long time because I really was working on just how to structure the book, like Rishi was saying, and how to incorporate a lot of the information in the book. And I hadn't been there, like I think Daphne was saying, I had never been to the place when I started. And so there was a lot that I had to sort of do to work on it. So that was sort of my journey with the book.
Yeah, and that was a related question for you, Daphne, and a number of you, in addition to your journey. People are wanting to know if you did travel, they know that you didn't travel to Afghanistan, but people were wondering how, admiring your details, all of you, the detail selection is fantastic. How did you manage to do that, Daphne, without going there?
Well, part of it was that I told myself, well, when I wrote my first novel, Russian Winter, I had never been to Russia and in the 1950s, right? 1947 to 1952. And with that one, I didn't travel there until I'd written it. And so I told myself, you did it once, you can do it again. But the truth is, I think it still makes a difference to travel there, even if you've already written the book, because then you can at least tell yourself, well, I did go. Right? Even if it's after the fact, you still have that feeling, right? It gives you a little more authority. And and it made a difference. I mean, the reason I was able to go to Russia in the end was because I had a friend from there, and I felt like I can go with her, right? She knows the place, and she can sort of be my escort, and that will be a certain kind of experience that I'll have. And I didn't have that with Afghanistan. And then by the time, then it just became too dangerous, more importantly. So I just basically spoke to people and read and looked at you know, clips of things where I needed to see things visually. And then when I had what I needed in the end, I actually found somebody from the exact kind of region and place where that part of the book was set. And I asked if she could read and fact check for me everything. And she did. And then after I'd done my revision, I had her read again, actually. But what was interesting was, to me, was that when she read, her, besides just finding little tiny details where she would say, well, I don't think she'd wear that makeup. I didn't think she'd have that mascara. I think she'd just have eyeliner. I mean, she was so specific about little tiny details about things. But her main point when she read the first draft is, she said, everybody portrays Afghanistan as, oh, it's so sad. It's so sad. And she said, can you please show people being funny and happy? You know, she said, please. And I'd seen examples of Afghan humor everywhere in my research, but she wanted to show like relationships that were joyous and funny and joking, you know? And so that was why I changed certain people as characters and tried to show that because of her.
Yeah, and I know Rishi and Jeffrey, you both did travel to the places that your books were set, right? You made at least one or more trips, right?
I made several trips there, and the great, for me, the most special part of my research was to speak with the children, you know, then 67 in their 60s and 70s of the population that I was writing about. So I went there several times, and you know, they welcomed me into their families and stuff. That was the most important part of the research to me.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I had the similar experience. I went to Halifax way back in early 2000s, and my experience was that it took a while to sort of get. I'm from America, not Canada, and not from the area, so it took a while to sort of get in with the people who were there. But eventually, I began to interview people, and I actually, the woman who's on the cover of the book is actually, she looks much older. She was 16 at the time and lived in Africville before it was destroyed. And I interviewed her as well. She's still living up in Halifax. And so there are people that were connected with some of the work that had been done after the fact who I connected with. But it was quite an experience being someone not from Canada. One of the things that came up as an issue was this idea of, taking a story that's not my own. I'm not from this town at all. So
I had that too, yeah.
So that was one thing that did come up for me. But yes, I did go up numerous times to Canada.
Jeffrey, that came up for me too. Like, what right do I have to tell this story about these families? And yeah, all years and years, it took a long time to get over that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a few people have asked questions about, the balance of, research. How did you keep your research from showing too much and, keep going with the story? How did you manage to hit that? How did you figure out that balance, so the research doesn't show too much, moving the story forward, but giving enough so that you've got the verisimilitude you need? Daphne, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, what I will say is I've noticed this in all three of my books, by the way, because at this point, every novel I've written has required a lot of research, even though I always say I won't do it again. And every time when I read through the drafts, I just find myself editing out. And I'm wondering if you both found that as well, that I just have to keep paring it down, because I think the instinct is always, we feel like we need to include more. I mean, you want to include more because it's interesting, and also you think that you need to explain more, and it often, I think, less is always more. That's what I've learned in the end.
Well, this is my first novel, and so Daphne, I mean, I sort of listen to other writers and how they do it as well. But I agree with you. I have had to do a lot of cutting and paring back. I tend to overwrite when I'm writing, include a lot of information. And I've learned, it's taken me a while, I think, to sort of get at what's the right balance. But I think I'm working on a new book now, and I'm taking some of the things I've learned in the first book from that. But it is a challenge because you do want to add a lot of the historical, especially historical, you're doing historical fiction. You want to add the details. And so I have to keep thinking, like Daphne was saying, to pare down.
Yeah, the temptation to show off everything you now know is so seductive. I mean, look at what I know. You gotta get past that.
Yeah, there was a comment that they imagine, people were wondering, what was the thing that you really wanted to include that you just couldn't, squeeze in there. I'm sure there were a number of things that you had to cut that just kill you. Yeah.
Absolutely. I had a whole thing about one of the only woman that is there in the Imperial Valley home. I had a whole thing about her backstory and how she happened to arrive there. And I realized, wow, this book isn't about her. I can't, I mean, she's a character there, but I can't, divert to show everything I know about her.
Yeah. Yeah. What did Daphne and Jeffrey, did you have to cut one thing in particular that just drove you crazy?
Well, I had to cut an entire subplot.
Yeah, okay. There you go.
That was a tough one. Yeah, that was one of the things I had to cut an entire subplot. But but that book was better in the end.
Right.
And I'm sure I know I merged entire characters. So
yeah.
At this point, I can't even remember. But also, yes, I'm sure there was some really nice, beautiful, juicy details that I would have loved to share, and I can't remember which ones they are at this point.
Yeah.
That are left in my files on my computer.
Yeah. We'll ask one more question and then we'll wrap up. There are a few more, but I know everyone's pressed for time. And thank you all for hanging on for another 10 minutes or so. We really appreciate it. And to everybody in the audience too, it's been so wonderful. So the last question is, somebody wanted to know what compels each of you to write this historically based, fiction. What was the essential question that kind of drove you forward in choosing this material? Do you want to start, Jeffrey?
Well, I am from Alabama, and history seems to be everywhere in Alabama. I mean, obviously, I grew up. I was young during the civil rights movement, but I remember it. And so, even the towns that were near me, there was always things going on, and people were talking about history. And we in school, we take trips to sort of Native American burial grounds and those kinds of things. And so I always had an interest in history. So I think that was the thing that kept me sort of, and then when I became a writer, the idea of blending the two, sort of my love of history and writing of fiction appealed to me. So I think it was that, the idea. I was not a history major, but I enjoy reading it on my own. I think that was, was good for me.
Yeah. And what about you, Daphne?
I feel like so much of what I write is about these reverberations of history. I mean, in my short stories as well. And I don't think I even knew consciously when I started writing. Honestly, when I began writing this book in, I think 2011, 2012, I was just kind of free writing, trying to remember what New York City used to be like. And then when I started thinking about what was happening back then, and then you do start to sort of follow those arrows and see what happened because of this, right? What happened because of that first war, right? Where did we end up? Oh, we ended up back in Iraq, right, in 2003. How was the US viewed, right, afterwards? and ever since then, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I always, I feel like everything I write is about what happened then and what happened later and what are the connections between them. And so I want to look at that on the one hand, on this maybe kind of global scale, but also on this very intimate level of what did somebody do maybe personally, right? And in a relationship. So
And
that
what
was what
about,
I was trying to
oh,
do.
sorry, Daph. Yeah, thank you. And what about you, Rishi? What do you
Yeah,
think compelled you to write this?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that for me, if there was a book like this that had existed when I was a young person growing up here in the United States, from an immigrant family, like because I think I was 5 when I came over, it would have had great meaning for me. And that's why I think I wanted to finish this book. It was for that, the little girl or the teenager that I was. So I don't think I have another book in me that's like this. I hope not. But I think this one in particular was about filling that need that would have been very satisfying for the younger person that I was.
Yeah, great. Well, I want to thank you all again so much. It's so inspiring, and you're so talented and wonderful. And it was just a really, really wonderful reading and sharing the journey of your books too. So thank you all so much. A big round of applause. Not everybody can hear you. We can't all hear the applause, but it's there. It's there in waves and waves.
Julie, thank you for
Yeah.
how wonderfully you moderate these.
Yes,
Yes,
and
thank you
so I
very
just
much.
want to say a couple other thank yous, and I know everybody can go. First of all, as always, huge thank you to Belmont Books. In addition to our authors, please buy the books. Thank you. Thanks to Amanda. Um, thanks also to Grub Street and the Novel Incubator Program, and also the really great team who organizes Craft on Draft. Bonnie Walsh, thank you, Bonnie. Carol Gray, Rob Wilstein, our amazing chat master tonight. Thank you, Rob. And also Julie Peterson, who does social media. Michelle Hoover, as always, and also a shout out to Michelle Ferrara, who always does our pamphlet when we ask her. Thank you, Michelle. Finally, a huge thank you to all of you tonight who came. Without the support of writers and readers in the community, this event would not be possible. We also raise money for scholarships for Novel Incubator. We've actually raised money already to fund them for this year. But if you're interested and can help out, please give generously to our Novel Incubator scholarships to allow more writers to share and learn from the experience and to get their novels out in the world. I also want to thank everybody, to all the readers out there. Thank you, because you read and love books. We can have events like this. And also, I hope there's so many writers out there, and I really hope tonight was inspiring for you and just sending great vibes to all of you for your creative work. And as the winter comes on, keep writing. And thank you so much again. And everybody have a great evening. Bye. Thank you all.